So Man City completed the signing of Nico Gonzalez from Porto for £50 million. How much is their overall spending looking to be for the window?
I think when you add in the other costs, the ancillary costs, and the agent costs, you're talking about 200 million quid. So in terms of increasing the amortization in the books going forward, that's approximately 40 million pounds a year. It's a pretty significant amount of money. It is going to impact kind of, their overall PSR position going forward, because it's a big spend. But we'll have to see what goes out the other side. Clearly, they've made the saving on Kyle Walker going to Milan. From a wages perspective, it's probably best part of 5 million quid from now to the end of the season. So that will offset it slightly. But 4 players, 40 million quid amortization, and maybe 5 players if you include the South American. You've got additional additional wages as well. So significant spending. I mean, clearly the bulk of the Premier League spending was City's.
And then Man City turned down Chelsea's approach for Nico Riley. Man City obviously have high hopes for him. Is it not a surprise that they took that approach, given that they do want to put him in the first team, although he hasn't really played for them too much?
Well, I guess the most interesting thing actually was that they appeared to have been happy to sell. As long as they could get the buyback that they wanted, they would have actually sold. So I don't know. I mean, he's not played, and City seem to have been quite desperate in midfield. So the manager clearly doesn't think he's quite ready. But Chelsea seem to think he was. I don't really, from a Chelsea perspective, given that they've got Fernandes, Caicedo, and Lavia, it's very hard to see where he would have gone into to play any games at Chelsea either. So I don't know. It's quite an odd signing. I mean, it's also, as always, a puzzle as to how Chelsea have any capacity from a PSR perspective. We don't know yet what happened with the women's team and other potential property sales that got them through 23-24. We'll see by the end of March, we'll see the accounts and we'll know a bit more. But we don't know whether that's been approved yet or whether it was approved at the time of the account. So that might take a bit longer. If you remember, the sale of the property took until September of the following year. But clearly they think they've got some capacity. So they've obviously got a plan this season as well as to an asset that they're going to sell, because they will run at another £200 million loss this season, as we talked about before. It's now looking very likely that they have no front of shirt sponsor for the entire season, given that we're now at the 7th of February, which is, compared to last season, probably a hole in the accounts of £50 million compared to what they managed to get out of Infinite Athlete. In some, again, a bit of a mystery how that happened, but they seem to have been in the accounts. Given their commercial revenue that we saw from Deloitte. So we will see what their method of complying is, but they do seem to have been prepared to spend not only on O'Reilly from City, and that would have been a deal, I would have thought, at least £40 million. Also Murillo, they apparently had offered a record fee for Nottingham Forest, which would have been, I think, is that 60, maybe 65? So, yeah. Look, the question is, what, if City are selling a player to Chelsea at a time of relative crisis, you have to ask themselves why that player can't get in the City team. Now it would be more difficult, clearly, because City have signed Mamouche and Nico, so there's going to be 2 more players in that midfield forward area for O'Reilly to compete against. So, we'll have to see. But that deal would have been worth quite a lot of money to City if they'd have wanted to cash in.
And I read yesterday the Man City fans have wrote a letter to Khaldoon Al-Mubarak complaining about ticket price rises at the club. Do you think there's any chance the club could freeze the prices, or it's just an area they are continuing to try and increase revenue in?
Well, all of the clubs are looking at a match day and trying to drive match day, largely because we're now seeing that broadcast is flat. So unless you can get yourselves into the European competitions, you're going to have relatively flat media revenue. Commercial revenue is really tough at the moment. There's been some good growth generally, but some of the big ticket stuff, the stadium naming and the front of shirt, are becoming quite difficult properties to sell and to get brands to pay the big money, the sort of 20s, 30s, 40 million pounds per season. So that's a concern. They also look at the US and look at ticket prices coming out of the US and go, we are just charging far too little. And so the clubs want to put prices up. Now, clearly, there is a limit to what fans can pay. And City, I think you'll see these sorts of protests at all clubs. But the thing that people have to understand from the club's perspective is they want to have relatively small incremental increases each season. One, because costs are actually going up. So operating costs, even if you put wages to one side of footballers, wages of staff, non-football staff, and also the costs of actually operating the stadium are and have been going up quite a lot. A number of clubs, if you look at the operating expenses, so the operating expenses being those costs outside of the wage bill, those are going up in some clubs 20-25% at the moment. And certainly over the last 2 or 3 years, almost all of the clubs have had an increase of 20-25% just due to inflation and utility costs. So there is, a logical need from a business perspective. It's just very hard to argue about putting up the prices by 5%, 3%, 5%, whatever it is, when you're then spending literally millions of pounds on failed players and failed managers.